Epochs! Immediately, the 80 commandos, there's way more than 80 commandos in total, the rest are aboard these motor launches, the very small wooden-sided ships, but the Campbelltown itself has 80. Immediately, the 80 commandos unrolled their rope ladders and climbed down from both sides onto the improvised quay. They ran off to their targets, covered by the destroyer's 20mm gun, while by the light of their torches, the special squad ran down into the holds to set the scuttling fuses. On a level with the Vieux mole, the motor gunboat had veered seaward to leave the Campbelltown a free run. She continued to reply to the fire from the light guns posted on both sides of the Viel entree. Ryder had been relieved to hear the destroyer's crash, punctuated by the spray of sparks, and to see the commandos climbing down onto the improvised quayside. The motor launches on the starboard column had to land their assault troops at the stone stairs to the right of the entree, and the jetty of the Mindin ferry to the left of this same entrance from the riverside. Unfortunately, Motor Launch 192, which was leading this column, was the first to be hit by a shell, which set her on fire. Lieutenant Commander Stevens, flotilla leader in command, veered to port through the neighbouring column and managed to beach on the shallows south of the Vieux mole. Blinded and disturbed by this accident, the captains of Motor Launch 262 and 267, who were behind, missed the entree and had to make a complete circle in the roadstead before spotting their position again. The next Motor Launch 268 turned at the right moment to her landing point, but before reaching it was set on fire by a shell. Motor Launch 156, the fifth in this column, was badly hit at the beginning of the action. More than half her crew and commandos were out of the battle. The wheel was out of action. It had to turn off and try to get astern of the last boat still underway. The last boat in this column, Motor Launch 177, refused to be discouraged by the lot of those in front and managed to disembark her commandos at the ferry jetty. At the same moment, the motor gunboat put Colonel Newman and his staff ashore at the stairs opposite. When Motor Launch 177 drew astern to leave her landing point, Ryder gave its orders by a megaphone to go alongside the Campbelltown and take off the survivors of the crew. In the meanwhile, the motor gunboat made off and came alongside the stairs once more, near the lock gate, its bows towards the Loire. The motor torpedo boat, which approached, was hailed and stayed with the motor gunboat to await instructions. I mean, the idea, just to say, this is me now, just to say, the idea that these commandos would go and cause havoc in Saint Nazaire, all around, everywhere, the U-boat pens, all sorts of stuff, and then, sort of probably before the sun comes up, get back on the motor gunboat or the motor torpedo boat and sail away again and sail back to England. That was sort of the hope. That was the idea. Very hopeful thinking, really. After their detour, the motor launches 262 and 267 managed to disembark their troops on the south bank of the entree, the entrance. But they were so violently repulsed that they had to re-embark and retire beneath heavy fire. The troops in the boats of the port column, so 2 columns of raiders, allied raiders, the troops in the boats of the port column had to be disembarked at the stone stairs on the north side of the mole. Their main attack was to take possession of the old port, which consisted of a small islet bounded by the Loire, the Saint Nazaire basin, and the Ville and Nouvelle entrees. In order to do this, they had to blow up the locks and the swing bridges connecting the islet and the mainland. The crews landed from the Campbelltown and the motor gunboat on the Ponhuet Islet, bounded by the lock and the Saint Nazaire basin, had to join up with the others across the Viel entree swivel bridge, which would be later destroyed, so that the general re-embarkation on the mole would not be disturbed. Motor Launch 447, the leading ship of this column, approached the mole to port, but was set on fire before she arrived. Motor Launch 457, which followed, did not hesitate to attempt the same manoeuvre and managed to land her troops, manoeuvring to return to the stairs. The enemy concentrated their fire on it and set it on fire. Again, the hulls are made out of wood. Yeah, so not only not armoured remotely, but flammable. Pretty bad. Couldn't ask for really a kind of a worse ship to be doing this in, a worse boat rather to be doing this in. Okay, the story goes on. Between the two flaming boats, motor launch 307 made her way along the mole. She was machine gunned at point blank range in enfilade, and grenades were hurled at her from the wall. Her fire killed several Germans on the jetty, but she had suffered several casualties, and after breaching, had to set off again to attack the batteries and searchlights at Minden. Blinded by the searchlights, the flames and the smoke from the burning ships, Lieutenant Horlock overshot the mole. He brought his ship back to the boarding point, but came up against even stronger opposition, which forced him to turn back. Henderson, the last in the line, found himself in the same difficulties. We have seen that Motor Launch 446 took on board the passengers from Motor Launch 341. Remember that, when before everything had started, one of them just had an engine failure, so they all had to hop on board another one. So that's that one. Motor Launch 446. It's got twice as many men on it, packed full of men. So that one, arriving in turn near the mole, Lieutenant Falconer saw that the majority of his commandos were already out of the battle. After a consultation with their NCO, he gave up the attempt at landing. To sum up, all of the motor launches of the port column, only Motor Launch 457 managed to land her troops. But an additional piece of bad luck, she was carrying a demolition group, badly equipped to fight an advanced guard action at a particularly well-defended spot. There remained the motor launch armed with torpedoes. That was Motor Launch 270, and it was hit in the stern as she was trying to silence the guns at the entree. She had to pull away. The Motor Launch 160 brought the valuable support of her fire to this zone and then returned to the entree, where she fired her torpedoes at a ship anchored in the outer harbour, without being able to observe the results of her fire. Lieutenant Boyd then went to the rescue of the burning boats near the mole. He fished out 3 men and made a stern manoeuvre to come alongside the only part of Motor Launch 447 which was not yet ablaze. Surrounded by flames and smoke, he managed to embark 8 soldiers, 6 of whom were wounded, 4 sailors, and, finally, in accordance with the rules of the sea, Lieutenant Platt. And incidentally, that was his first day as commander of that motor launch. A bit of a baptism of fire for poor old Lieutenant Platt. The Motor Launch 298 fired on the batteries at the east of the lock and then on those on the mole. Crossing a sheet of burning petrol, she caught fire, becoming a concentrated target for the enemy. She blew up with all aboard. Okay, so if you can try and imagine the scene, you've got the big, relatively big, Campbelltown that's rammed the caisson, the wall of the dry dock, and it's sort of, the front of it is reared up over on top of it, but the big bomb hasn't gone off yet. It's not set to go off for a while. And then all the other boats, with their few hundred commandos, have various success in being able to get ashore. You know, 1 or 2 of them, or most of them, have been set alight or blown up. A bunch of the commandos have got ashore, bunch haven't. It's the lottery of war. And there's loads more detail about what happens to all the individual boats and the motor gun boat and the motor torpedo boat. They were supposed to just sit there and wait for the commandos to do their thing and then sail away. That was not really ever going to happen, right? It was pretty unrealistic. And so anyway, there's lots more detail about exactly what happens to all the various boats and motor launch boats, but I won't go into all of that. Let's just cut scene to what the commandos that were able to get ashore, what they do. Must have been a scene of just complete confusion, though. Things blowing up, loads and loads of fire going on from both sides. The night lit up by a trace of fire and explosions and fires and men screaming, men in the water. Just, the complete crazy confusion of war. Sort of no one really knows exactly what's going on, how that is, particularly because it's at night. All the best laid plans go out of the window a bit once contact has happened. It must have been very, very confusing and, terrifying as well. Okay, so here's what... I'll pick up the account a bit further on where it starts talking about what the commandos did once they got ashore. We're told, what had happened ashore? The motto of the commandos, quick in and quick out, was particularly applicable at Saint Nazaire, since it was estimated that the garrison numbered about 10,000 men. That includes sailors, infantry, gunners, flak, etc., and workers, etc. In actual fact, more than 100,000 Germans were in the region around the Loire estuary, from Pornichet Point to St. Gildas. So, by morning, it could be absolutely swamped with Germans, in other words. Newman had split his forces into small groups with orders to carry out in the minimum of time the exact tasks for which the men had been so carefully trained. The disadvantage of this procedure was that for each group which failed to land, some mission would not be carried out, and a lot of them had failed to land, one way or another. In actual fact, it was precisely the groups entrusted with the task of capturing and holding the re-embarkation point which would not carry out their mission. So the idea that many of these commandos are going to get away is becoming vanishingly small. It always was an extreme long shot, but now it's like, the party that was supposed to make that even remotely possible have failed. But could one operate any differently in the short time available? Furthermore, on such a long crossing, each motor launch could only carry 15 men in addition to its own crew. This meant splitting up the Commando, and the troop, which was the main formation for these special forces, comprising 65 men, was broken, i.e. the tip of the spear, of the Commando spear, 65 of them, out of well over 300, in all the confusion and everything, weren't all together in one group. So, again, it's all going awry quite quickly. But each one of these commandos is like a wrecking machine in and of himself. Each team had studied, down to the smallest detail, the model of Saint Nazaire harbour, reconstructed from the RAF reconnaissance photos. On this model, all the quays, sheds, good yards, sluices, bridges, cranes, railway lines, trenches and pillboxes were built to scale and in their actual aspects. The commandos in the Campbelltown were split into 5 groups of between 10 and 20 men each. Assault groups were ordered to capture the flak emplacements on either side of the lock gate. The first group was then to destroy the oil reservoirs and to prevent the arrival of enemy reinforcements from this direction. So again, just to remember, it's not just like a quayside, right? It's a giant deep water harbour complex. Right? There's loads and loads of things there. Loads and loads of structures and buildings and important infrastructure, Navy infrastructure that the Nazis want and need. And it's all just targets for these commandos now. Everything there, really. If they can destroy it, they will try. So there's just tons and tons of things for them to do, whilst they've got the luxury of the cover of darkness, at least. The second Commando assault group, coming off of the Campbelltown, was to make a bridgehead on the north side of the entree to collect all the Campbelltown groups once they had carried out their tasks. 2 demolition groups had to blow up the pumping station and the machinery of the north and south caisson gates, i.e. to truly put that dry dock out of action once and for all. The 5th group, composed of Major Copland, second in command to Newman, and 8 other men, was to supervise the assault from Campbelltown and the re-embarkation at the Mole. After the ramming, Lieutenant Roderick, at the head of the East Assault Group, captured the light batteries between the Lockgate and the Loire. 100 yards further on, he ran up against stiff opposition from German reinforcements, which greatly outnumbered his own group. As there was no possibility of pushing on any further, he held the enemy until the moment he took a spray of tracers for the signal to retire and fought his way back towards the entree. Captain Roy and his men landed at the same time on Penhuet Islet, quickly took the positions adjoining the quay. It now remained for him to put out of action the machine guns on the terraced roof of the pumping station. This pumping station was important for pumping the water out of the dry dock and making it a dry dock. If you could destroy that, that's very important. The big cube-shaped building stood close beside the lock gate. "Follow me," ordered Roy, and like Indians on the warpath, his men went forward in silence, skirting the west wall. The attention of the German gunners was obviously concentrated on the southern side, towards the roadstead, i.e. out to sea, out to the estuary. At the foot of the north wall, everything was quiet. Attach the ladders to the edge of the roof. Light ribbons of rope ladder were unrolled like serpents, and after a few attempts, hung down from the wall. All together, up you go! In the excitement, and deafened by the noise of their own firing, the German gunners did not see the smeared faces with their flat steel helmets suddenly emerge over the parapet of the roof. In an instant, they were put out of action by a few unexpected Tommy gun bursts. Climbing down from their terrace, Roy and his men proceeded to hold the bridgehead, as arranged, in front of the bridge crossing the entree. While they were attacking the roof, the Sabotage squad had forced an entrance into the building. The huge iron door was locked. "Give me the gun, Cotton," called Lieutenant Chant. In a flash, the explosive was in place. Retreat, crash, lock broken. "Come on, look out, it's a vertical descent." He rushed down the iron ladder which led to the turbines of the pumping station, 40 feet below. "You know your jobs. You take the switchboards, you the valves down there at the bottom, you get on with the electronic motors, and we'll look after the transformers." So each man knows what he's got to do. Almost simultaneously, the explosions shook the ground. Chant immediately went back to inspect the damage. "Not a bad job," he said to his men. "I hope they'll enjoy it when they return." The Germans, that is. "I hope they'll enjoy the damage we've done." And then he said, "Set the transformer oil on fire. It won't do any harm." Why not? While we're here. At the same moment, the team at the control post of the southern lock gate blew up the machinery. For their part, Lieutenant Itches and 17 men ran off towards the north of the lock. They placed their charges along the gate in such a way as to scuttle it and to prevent it being manoeuvred. The northern control post was completely destroyed and set on fire. In this way, all the teams from the Campbelltown carried out their missions with conscientious rapidity. So that's one part of the mission that went really, really well. On landing from the motor gunboat, Colonel Newman, the overall commander, most senior officer, Colonel Newman, his adjutant, Captain Day, and 6 other men of his staff made their way towards the building situated south of the Entree Bridge, where it had been planned to make a temporary headquarters. They ran into a German sentry who, under the threat of a Tommy gun, declared that the building in question was occupied by a German headquarters. "Go and tell them to come out with their hands up," Newman told him. The man disappeared. No one came out, but a boat in the basin opened fire on them. Very opportunely, they were reinforced by Hayes's group, the only one which was able to land from Motor Launch 177 on the Minden Ferry pontoon near the Entree. The rest of the troops, which were to have brought the materiel, and in particular special flares with 35 red and green stars intended for the re-embarkation signal, could not get ashore from Motor Launch 267. They had to act quickly. The German destroyers anchored in the basin now added their fire to that of the machine guns mounted on the roof of the submarine pen. A giant submarine pen it was. I think the biggest in Europe, the biggest the Atlantic had. While Hayes replied with his 2-inch mortar, the German headquarters was cleared with grenades and taken over by commandos. The Motor Launch 192, leader of the starboard column, hit at the start, was steered by the flotilla leader, Lieutenant Commander Stevens, towards the shallows south of the mole. On board were Captain Byrne and 14 men charged to capture the 2 flak nests on the extreme north of the islet, near the swivel bridge separating the 2 basins. After being landed between the outer harbour and the mole, Byrne and the survivors of his group managed to cross the Saint Nazaire islet as far as the Entree. After this, they followed the west quay of the islet to their objective, which they found unoccupied. The installations were burnt. Swiftly, after operating on the islet, all the groups retired to headquarters and reported to Newman that their tasks had been carried out. Major Copland came back with his group and discussed with his chief the possibilities of re-embarkation. The moment had come to retire to the Roye bridgehead, south of the Entree. In default of the flares which had been arranged, a runner was sent. Corporal Harrington rushed over the bridge, which was swept by fire from the destroyers and from the submarine base, and returned with Roy's group. So far, everything had gone well ashore, but what would be the reaction of these men when they learnt that all hope of re-embarkation had been abandoned? So the commandos, the ones that have got ashore, have done relatively well for themselves, to be honest. Blown up and destroyed plenty of stuff, all the main things. The main thing was that dry dock. That giant dry dock, which would have helped the fantastically powerful Nazi battleships, capital battleships, to keep going, keep taking the war to us in the Atlantic. That is put out of action on multiple levels. That has been achieved. So already, basically, a success. In Churchill's mind, Churchill will be happy with that. If everything else fails, Churchill will be happy. Okay, the story goes on. The only group landed on the mole was Captain Pritchard's demolition squad, which had to blow up the swing bridge and the southern lock gate of the Nouvelle Entree. As soon as they were ashore, these men came under violent simultaneous fire from the mole pillbox, the roof of a nearby shed, and the very tall building near the submarine pen, from where the Germans were able to enfilade the street that crossed the old port on a level with the mole. While they were seeking shelter in vain behind some railway trucks, several of them fell, including Captain Pritchard. They were joined by the covering group of 5 men under Lieutenant Watson, who had landed near the same motor launch. So they're pinned down and taking heavy fire and losses. They decided to make their way to the swing bridge by skirting a shed to reach the Basin Quay, but as soon as they tried to round the corner of this building, they were caught once more in a converging fire from the destroyers and the machine guns of the submarine pen. Time was slipping by. They had to get it over. Watson decided to make an attempt at all costs to reach the Nouvelle Entrée in a succession of rushes. They're in a terribly tight spot. They have to run for their lives, even through fire. It's that or just all get killed. Right? Everyone set! At that moment, a man rushed towards them, shouting an order. It was a runner from headquarters, giving the order for a general assembly at the mole. Very disappointed at the thought of not having carried out their mission, they assembled near an old building 50 yards west of the mole. It was here that the real tragedy awaited these men. Not a single motor launch lay alongside, and as far as the eye could see, over the roadstead, hulks were still burning, surrounded by sheets of burning petrol. All hope of being re-embarked had to be abandoned. Right, the idea of getting back on a boat and sailing out of the Loire estuary back into the sea and back to England, that's not happening. It's not going to happen. Newman immediately called Copeland and Day for a discussion behind a railway truck and told them of his intention to force a passage through the town. So we're not going back by sea, so we'll keep going then. We'll keep forcing our way into the actual town of Saint Nazaire, not just the port area. That's what they decided. He would let the men split up in the country, i.e. escape an invasion in any way you can. At a certain point, every man for himself. He would let them split up in the country so that they could try and make their way back to England through Spain or any other way they chose. Remember, we're in Normandy, right? Northwest France. Try and get to Spain or back to England however you can. I mean, it's absolutely desperate, almost no hope stuff, isn't it? And to be fair, these are brave men. They knew they were probably going to end up, having to resort to something like this. Everyone knew. They weren't naive. That the idea that the ships would just sit there whilst they blew up the harbour of Saint Nazaire, one of the most heavily defended places in Nazi-occupied Europe, that those ships wouldn't get blown up or sunk and they would be able to get back on them and sail out of the estuary again. Very, very unlikely from the moment of conception, that idea. So the fact that they ended up having to resort to this is, most men probably knew that was likely to be the case. These men, armed against all physical and moral ordeals, were by no means downcast at the tragedy of their situation. They had long been prepared for the worst eventualities. This was one of those which always have to be envisioned in such forays. We knew, said one of them, obviously later, we knew that unless there was a surprise at the last moment, we had little chance of ever being re-embarked. Newman was perfectly cool and even made a few jokes. What a magnificent moonlit night. A night for lovers, eh? We hope you enjoyed that video, and if you did, please head over to lotuseaters.com for the full unabridged video.